really I'm going to focus most of today's talk about almost a 4-year grant that we just wrapped up at the end of last year. It was through the HUD, the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Office, called the Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grant. Really kind of a once-in-a-generation opportunity where the federal government put a lot of resources into regional planning. That's why I came to MAPC, the regional planning agency, to get involved in that grant. And it was really kind of a fantastic opportunity for the agency and for many of our partners that you'll hear about. And because this is environmental studies and HUD isn't super focused on the environment, I'm going to talk a little bit about really focusing more on the environmental work that we did as part of that grant, and then some of the current work that really grew out of that grant that we're doing now, really focusing on climate change. So hopefully there'll be interest in what we're talking about today. So planning is pretty broad ranging. There's a lot of generalists at our agency. And it really, I think, as environmental studies majors, I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of looking at the world through an interdisciplinary lens with different specialties that are part of it. But just a quick kind of way we approach it is, we've historically done housing planning, transportation planning, environmental planning, but in recent years, we've really branched out into a lot more. We have a very large data services that does research and analysis of regional trends. We have a public health division, which has been around about 5 years now. And I think, in recent years, there's been just much more research in terms of the interaction between the built environment and public health that we're now kind of incorporating into our planning approaches. And we have a whole clean energy division that works with our cities and towns on renewable energy and energy efficiency programs. So our region, we're in Greater Boston, 101 cities and towns. We have just over half of the state's population and about 2/3 of our jobs. And I think there are 13 regional planning agencies in the state of Massachusetts. So real quick, what our mission is to promote smart growth and regional collaboration. We also have a municipal collaboration group that does shared services, procurements. We buy fire trucks for cities and towns to save them money. So we're looking at efficiencies and helping municipal operations become more effective, as well as kind of the historical work on land use, environment, housing, et cetera. And like I mentioned, we're going to go through the regional plan. It's called MetroFuture. We launched this in 2008, and we've been consistently updating it since then. And that was really what we applied for the HUD grant to do, is basically implement that plan with a number of partners. And finally, unlike a lot of states where you have county governments or regional agencies that actually have regulatory authority, our regional planning agencies, with a couple exceptions, like down on the Cape, really don't. We're advisory. We do a lot of advocacy. We work with cities and towns on zoning, land use plans, but ultimately it's up to the cities and towns what they're going to do with those plans. So we can have the best plan in the world, but if you don't have that local buy-in, that local constituency, it's not going to go anyplace. So I think you're going to hear a lot about kind of their approach to make sure that our plans go someplace and actually turn into change on the ground. So in the early 2000s, it was time to update our regional plans. So a lot of this was really engaging the people in our region, finding out what their aspirations were, what their goals were, what they find needs help, where we should focus our energies. And these are some of the things that we heard where we want to be. And as a land use planning agency, basically we took an approach where what happens if we keep growing the way we've been growing? What happens if we don't change policies at the local, at the state level, at the regional level? If we keep doing what we're doing, this is what we think will happen in terms of where the new housing units will locate, basically scattered throughout the region, fairly low density, which is a disaster from an environmental and transportation and housing and equity standpoint. And basically, we looked at, again, current trends continuing. Right now, an acre is about 40,000 square feet. That's a lot of land for a single house. And if we keep building this way, we're going to keep consuming our natural resources and leading to habitat fragmentation. And here's the open space. Right down here, kind of where 495 goes, the Mass Audubon, they do a report every 5 years or so called Losing Ground, which looks at development patterns in the state. And this area right through here is known as the Sprawl Frontier, where you are seeing rapid development, but really of a low density, not a lot of mixed use, and just a lot of land for each housing unit that's being built. Traffic congestion, if you are traveling in from not Boston or Somerville, you know what this is like during rush hour. Flip on the morning news and 93, Route 9, 90, you know, they're pretty much all bad. And right now, if we keep on locating jobs and housing in the far fringes of the state, it's just going to get worse and worse. Water shortages, back in 2000, this is what it looked like in terms of regulatory deficits, where they're actually pulling out more water than is allowed under their permit or is sustainable. And if we keep doing this, this is what it's likely to look like in 2030. And climate change, this was something that we really have beefed up our work in, which I'm going to end today's talk on. But just in terms of regional challenges, these are things that we're basically looking at already in terms of some of the impacts that we're seeing. And these are things that are affecting our coastal cities and towns, but also our inland communities as well, in terms of the changing climate, impacts to agriculture, and excessive storm events and heat events. So this is kind of the process that we took in terms of developing MetroFuture. And like I said, we did a number of different scenario modeling in terms of looking at how aggressive we could become in terms of changing. You know, basically we call it bending the trends in terms of changing our current trajectory to a more smart growth consistent one. And this is what we ended up with. It's a pretty beefy document. Much better to look at it online, but 65 goals with 13 implementation strategies, everything from housing, economic development, regional collaboration. And again, a big part of this plan development was really going out in the communities, the 101, and talking to people and bringing them along, getting their ideas, and really helping to shape the plan through that engagement. And these are the vision statements in terms of where all of that engagement, all these ideas in terms of what people wanted to see. And right up here, the engagement was a clear one, and that's something that I think we really took a lot of steps forward in terms of our current practice as a regional planning agency, as with the HUD Sustainable Communities Grant. And if people have questions, you can feel free to jump in as we go here. So again, you already saw this one in terms of the current trends. The MetroFuture strategy looks at a lot more focused in the inner core communities right around within the 128 belt, where there's a lot of infrastructure, and then some places in the outlying area where there are job centers and existing infrastructure and transportation. And again, the more suburban growth, we have a much higher kind of quantitative objectives in terms of what we want to see our policies result in. And we, I mean the region, not just my agencies, but we really want to focus that growth in places that have already been developed, so through redevelopment, and in existing places where there's already infrastructure and services. And we really want to see a big shift in terms of housing. We came out with a report about probably a year and a half ago now on our regional housing demand. And kind of the key takeaway of that is, I'm sure all of you know what housing prices are like here. It's really unsustainable. But in terms of making that link to, if we want to remain a competitive region and grow our economy and keep people like you here after you graduate and are looking for jobs and want to start families and stay here, we need to have much more affordable housing. And right now, we find a deficit through 2040 of about 400,000 units in the eastern part of Massachusetts. So that's a lot of units, and housing development, if you follow any of the local battles, it pretty much is a local battle. Whether you're in a neighborhood in Boston like I am, or out in a developing or maturing suburb, every development proposal seems to end up as kind of a fight with, no, we don't want development, there's going to be new school kids, there's going to be this, there's going to be that. But at the same time, it's really critical to our economy to build these new units. And what's also critical is the type of unit we build. So right now, we've historically been, great at producing well, maybe not great, but decent at producing single-family units. But with our changing demographics and the environmental considerations and people's housing preferences, we're seeing a much bigger need for apartments, townhouses, condominiums. When people no longer want to rake the leaves and shovel the driveway, there are other choices out there, and a lot of our suburbs don't have these or have very few opportunities for a diversity of housing types. So that's been a major focus of the work we've done over the last 5 years. And the water system shortages, you saw what our estimates were in terms of if we do it right and we put the right policies in place, we're looking at a much less dire water problem. And I think what's going to be interesting on this too is what happens with climate change. Yes. Sure. Sure. So the question is, how do we actually get the 52% of suburban housing through reuse and redevelopment? And I think you're absolutely right. One of the key there is looking at rezoning. Most of our smaller and developing towns don't have high-density zoning. Even in the village centers, town centers, a half acre per unit is kind of what you see as the most dense. But I think that's starting to change, but it is going to take changes at the local level in terms of their zoning and in terms of what's able to be permitted. Absolutely. These were our 6 super goals that came out of our planning, looking at sustainable growth patterns, housing choices we just talked about, healthy communities in terms of people being safe and having access to fresh food and not basically vulnerable to crime. Regional prosperity, so how are we doing in terms of our economy, both regionally and at the household level. Transportation choices, you've probably been hearing a lot about this, especially if you were here last winter with the MBTA and all of those difficulties, but that's been a major asset to our region, but also one of our big vulnerabilities in terms of making sure we have a world-class public transportation system that can be relied on and you don't have to drive. And finally, and last but not least, is a healthy environment, which people in this room know a lot about. And how do we do this? Through a lot of coordinated actions and a lot of coordinated players. And this is just a schematic for what the region could look like in terms of concentrated development, obviously in the inner core where a lot of the new growth is going right now, and also in the suburban centers where there is infrastructure and there are already jobs today. And again, a lot of this is coordination, working with people, and working at the State House as well to change the state policies and laws. And this gets us to sustainable communities. This is what brought me to MAPC. It was really kind of a once-in-a-generation opportunity that the federal government actually came up with significant dollars to put into planning and implementation. And really their goals were twofold. They wanted to advance equity and sustainability. And again, it was a partnership with HUD was the primary federal agency, but they did partner with the DOT, the Department of Transportation, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. But our main work was with HUD, but we were awarded $4 million over 3.5, 4 years that really enabled us to branch off into a lot of new directions, engage a lot of new partners, and really make a difference in the region. So who is eligible for this? Almost everybody. We had a lot of partners at the state agency, at the local level. This happened before I came, but in terms of signing up people to be part of what was called the Metro Boston Consortium, we ended up with almost 100, I think right on the number, 170 organizations and entity and agencies that were partners in this grant. And then we had to create a governance structure. Again, we spent a lot of time and effort, and it took a while to actually get to the projects because we had to spend a fair amount of time organizing ourselves and our partners. But I think what was interesting is it was not MAPC that made the decisions in terms of how we spent this money. It was a consortium steering committee. It was the steering committee right here of 27 members, and it had broad representation really from all sectors. So community development organizations, state agencies, our partners, the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance, and some of the funders in the private sector, such as the Barr Foundation, which does a lot of work in this area. And then in terms of what the plan was, we really focused on these 6 or so kind of broad program areas in terms of everything from filling gaps. You're going to hear more today about the climate change. Back when we did the plan in 2008, people were starting to talk about climate change mitigation and adaptation, but it wasn't that well developed. So we have a couple strategies in our original 2008 plan, but it was a gap in terms of how much more science and how much more knowledge there is in those last 8 years. The regional housing plan, which I mentioned, again, there's always a constantly shifting the demographic and markets, so we needed to update that. The indicators work in terms of looking at hard data in terms of how we're doing as a region. This is something that is basically going to be an ongoing project, but through Sustainable Communities, we were able to launch a number of different indicator studies, including the state of equity. Tools, models, best practices. You know, we're one agency. There's a lot of great work happening across the country and across our region. We can only do so much. So a lot of what we tried to focus on was, you know, what's working elsewhere, and package that and provide that information, those best practices, to our communities. So even if we're not working directly with them, that they can take these ideas and implement them locally. Place-based planning, I'd say, is really at the heart. So basically looking at site-specific projects. We did a lot of transit-oriented development plans where if you have a train station, whether it's commuter rail or subway station, basically looking at, you know, to the question earlier in terms of how do you redevelop these areas, a lot of these have surface parking lots, underutilized one-story buildings, and, you know, this is kind of the prime place to be putting new jobs, new housing. So a lot of our projects looked at this, and then again, as transit-oriented development, this is completely interdisciplinary. So looking at housing, looking at jobs, looking at potential flood impacts in terms of coming up with new strategies and recommendations for these areas that are really prime for new growth. But as you can see, we did really a wide variety of planning. We did an agricultural plan. It's called the Magic subregion, the Minuteman area out in like Concord, Lexington, Bedford, those communities out towards 495, where we did a regional local agricultural system plan, and a lot of housing work and bike and pedestrian work. So it was really comprehensive, I guess is the word, in terms of the types of projects that we were able to do with this project. And a lot of the work that came out of these local plans results in policy recommendations. Some of it's, again, the local zoning recommendations, but a lot of work we do is really focused at the State House in terms of what changes can we make, what new programs, what new funding can we advocate for to actually make this happen. You know, I think transportation is a good example where we working with many partners, were able to get some new revenue a couple of years ago into transportation, but obviously the work's only, you know, part the way there. I think we need a lot more revenue if we're going to really fix this transportation system. And zoning reform, this is something near and dear to my heart. We have some of the most antiquated zoning laws in the country. So we do have a bill that's been a couple years now. We've been working at it, but we'll basically update the state's planning, zoning, and subdivision framework to really provide a lot more cutting edge and just, you know, state-of-the-art tools to cities and towns. A lot of things many states have, we just don't have here. So we're kind of doing the best we can with a somewhat limited regulatory framework. And last, again, but not least, we did a lot of consortium dialogue and capacity building. There's so much untapped potential in the region, and a lot of our efforts are really focused on engaging communities that aren't typically showing up at the town meetings, at the planning boards, and really helping to identify and train new leaders to help carry this work forward. Yeah.
I wanted to go back here because I live in Arlington. I'm trying to figure out to what extent is it Arlington laws that matter or is it state laws that matter? And I guess and you mentioned something in the state house, but I was assuming you were going to say it's all at the local level. Arlington's antiquated or Lexington's antiquated. So what are the antiquated state level policies that you're referring to, and how do they intersect with the city?
Great question. So basically the question is, how much of the antiquated zoning framework is at the local level versus the state level? I'd say it's really a combination. I mean, I think there are a lot of communities that we're a home rule state, so if it's not addressed in state law, cities and towns can come up with their own approach, as long as it doesn't run afoul of other laws or the Constitution. So there's a lot of innovative things that just happen on that. But one example is inclusionary zoning. This is a zoning practice that's been around a long time. City of Boston has it, Somerville has it. I think Somerville is actually looking at updating it. But what it does is provides for the inclusion of affordable units that are deed restricted as part of a private development. So say you have a development coming in of 100 units, a city zoning bylaw or ordinance could say, you need to set aside 15% of those for people at low and moderate incomes. So that's not addressed in the state zoning code at all. So cities and towns have done it, but they've done it really at their peril in case if those laws were to be challenged, there's no kind of safe harbor or state enabling statute to back that up. So I think that's an example where you can do progressive things, but you're kind of doing it on your own. I think another example is development impact fees. A lot of times when a development project comes to a city or town board, it's this case-by-case negotiation in terms of how much the developer is going to pay for the impacts. But there's no, again, enabling code that would set up a predictable and transparent process. So it's a kind of a case-by-case negotiation, and you hear the horror stories about they ask for band uniforms for their high school kids, which has nothing to do with the impacts of a development project. So I guess the short answer is it's a combination of both. Back on the indicators, this is something that I think we've always been committed to, the notion of equity, but I think with sustainable communities that really put it in the forefront of our work. And we've always been committed to advocating for affordable housing, advocating for public transportation, and the kind of things that make a more equitable region. But really for the first time, our leadership with kind of the focus from HUD in this grant, we're really able to look at equity on things like the minimum wage and on income and economic security issues, things that don't have a really direct tie to land use, but really do have an impact on the region. So back in 2011, we did the regional indicators on state of equity in terms of how equitable or inequitable our region is, and then came out another year or two later with a policy agenda in terms of actions that can be taken by MAPC and our allies, and plenty of groups have been fighting for equity for years. So just trying to call more attention to that and add our voice to the fight. Talked a little bit just now about what we're doing at the State House. Again, a lot of the work does come down to the State House, and I think with this administration, their resistance, at least at this point, to talking about new revenues, that's something that is going to be a challenge for a lot of this agenda, and a lot of our needs are financial. So that's something that we do advocate for, especially on the climate change. There's not a lot of state resources right now on climate change planning or reaction implementation of recommendations to basically help cities and towns get ready for climate change. The regional analysis of fair housing. This was a regional housing plan down in some of the South Shore communities. Again, a lot of what we do is regional and multi-municipal, working because a lot of our markets, whether it's the housing market, the job market, and again, almost all of our natural resources don't stop at municipal boundaries. So a lot of our work really is focused on both the big region of 101, but also on the smaller clusters of municipalities. Again, I'm just kind of taking you through a little bit of work we did on the South Shore to show kind of some of the work we did. We worked with the Asian community in Quincy. As you can see by this graphic here, really a growing percent of the population, but one that hasn't really engaged that effectively with the power structures at the local level. Kind of on their own in a lot of ways. So through this grant, working with the Asian CDC, Community Development Corporation, we really worked with them to help figure out, what their issues, concerns are, and basically tried to bring the Asian community closer in line with the city of Quincy in terms of a lot of development proposals are happening in that city, making sure that new development basically works for all the residents. And again, part of this was leadership development. And there's a lot we did on engagement. I think maybe if anything, one of the big takeaways that's really changed my agency is a real focus on engagement. We have 2 full-time community engagement specialists that are basically organizers that figure out ways to bring people in. So many public meetings you go to, you have somebody standing up going, this is the site plan elevation and blah, blah, blah. And, for most people, unless you're an architect, it's just you're not getting much out of those kind of meetings. So talking about how do you design a meeting to really get people involved, to get their ideas, and to make sure that they're shaping the plans that are going to affect their community, and that when you have that plan at the end of the day, you have a constituency that's going to support it, and it's not just going to die on the town meeting floor. We actually made a video game in Quincy in terms of basically helping people explore their community and what kind of things they value that's there today, and also what they'd like to see moving forward. And this was a program that we created with a number of partners kind of in the equity world. It's called iLead. But basically, we worked with a number of organizations and communities, mostly in the inner core, Quincy, Somerville, some Dorchester and Roxbury, but basically identifying potential community leaders and basically providing training about how to get involved and really be able to influence the conversations about development and how you can be a voice for the future of your community. And again, a lot of the work we did was the TOD, the Transit Oriented Development work, which actually looked at sites and figured out what could be there if you change the zoning, if you change the parking requirements, if you got the MBTA to get out of their own way and really open up some of these sites for development. This is, again, in Quincy and Wollaston Center, a T station, which actually now is going out for an RFP in terms of seeking new development proposals right at that subway station. And again, in Quincy, we also focus on bike and pedestrian connections. I think this is something that Boston and the region is finally getting more serious about and better. I mean, I think with the Green Line coming here and the community path, I think we're seeing some progress here, but then you look at other cities across the country and the world, and I think there's a lot more that we can be doing. But in terms of make sure there are multi-modes and different ways of getting around, whether it's shopping, to work, to school, biking and walking is a big piece of this. And then part of the Addressing Gaps, like I mentioned, was on climate change. What we did as part of the Sustainable Communities Project program was a regional climate adaptation strategy. So we've done a lot of work there's been some work done at the state level in terms of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the state climate plan. We hadn't done anything really at the regional level. So we took a look at what the recent climate trends are, what we're expecting to see in terms of impacts, we looked at really a vulnerability analysis in terms of what sectors are likely to be impacted the most severely by climate change, and then have a number of recommendations for actions that we and our cities and towns and state and nonprofit communities can take to be ready for climate change. Some of the things that were already happening right here in terms of more frequent storm events, more heat, the winter snowpack, and we're already seeing the temperature increasing. And sea level rise, this is a huge issue. I mean, we're spending billions of dollars down in the Seaport District in Boston, and you know, this is an area that's very vulnerable to sea level rise. And this gives you an idea of kind of the impacts that we could see that we have to start planning for today. I'm not exactly sure on the timeline, but I want to say it's 100 years. I think that's been kind of the horizon that a lot of the studies have been using. And this is the approach that we take in terms of the vulnerability analysis. And I think you'll see in a little bit, we've been doing more at the municipal level, but a big part of, you know, number one there, the human health and welfare, is looking at vulnerable populations in terms of, you know, seniors, people with medical conditions, people that will need extra help, whether it's from a storm event or heat event, and making sure that those vulnerabilities are identified and that there are solutions put in place so people are ready. Coastal zone obviously is a huge area in Boston. I'm not sure how many miles of coastline we have, but there's a lot. And a lot of our new development is on the coast. A lot of our expensive real estate's on the coast. We have Cape Cod. Everybody loves to go there in summer. But you know, we definitely have some major vulnerabilities that we're going to have to deal with as a state. Natural resources and habitat, the built environment, and local economy and governments were the last areas that we look at whenever we do a vulnerability analysis. Vulnerable populations that I just talked a little bit about. And a big piece of this is terms of, you know, there's a distinction I want to make between planning for people and planning with people. And in all our plans, we really try to work with the people directly to really hear, you know, firsthand what their issues are, what their ideas are, and really work with that, as opposed to, you know, sitting in our office in downtown Boston and coming up with recommendations that could potentially affect people. A couple of Venn diagrams coming up here, but you know, the three-legged stool in terms of where we look at impacts and really trying to keep all three of these, you know, very important pieces in terms of what we're doing and what we're looking at. And then here is kind of a graphic showing kind of that mitigation versus adaptation. Mitigation, I think, as a state and even as an agency, we've been a lot more focused on in recent years. There's been a lot of, you know, great work in the state of Massachusetts on clean energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, those kind of practices. Really a lot less on adaptation, and I think that is changing. You know, I think, you know, after Superstorm Sandy and the devastation we've seen there, there's been a lot more focus on that, and that's really where we're heading as an agency as well. And then in the little overlap area is kind of the sweet spot of activities and actions that get both at mitigation and adaptation. In terms of the three elements, you have the protect. A lot of this is like the hardening of seawalls, making sure that key infrastructure, whether it's water systems or wastewater systems, are protected from storm surge and flooding. Accommodate, you know, green infrastructure techniques, a lot of fall into here, where it's a softer approach where you're not going to stop the water, but you have a way to figure out how to deal with it, how to live with it, and not have catastrophic losses. And retreat, you know, really vulnerable areas maybe we shouldn't be building in, and in some cases like Plum Island, you know, every spring it seems like there's a new house that tumbles into the Atlantic Ocean, there are some areas that really make sense to relocate, and through buyouts or other strategies to get people out of harm's way. And 4, I really hope is not really an option, but you know, depending on what happens in Washington, that will have an impact on what we're doing as a country and as a globe. But I think there are a lot of things we can do here that we can control. And just kind of wrapping up in terms of our experience with sustainable communities, these are some of the key early findings. You know, a lot of what we're doing as a land use planning agency is long-term. If you work on a zoning project, those projects can take 6 months, a year, year and a half, and that gets you a zoning recommendation. It takes even more time to take that recommendation and get it passed at the local level, especially in Massachusetts. A lot of our towns basically operate with an open town meeting that needs 2/3 of a vote to pass zoning. So it's a long process, and a lot of these are long-term challenges, but that's why we need to start today in terms of taking the actions that we need to get ready for what happens in the future. If there's anything, I should mention the priority development areas. Sorry, planners love our acronyms, but the PDAs are priority development areas. This is something we've been working with many of our subregions on in terms of basically mapping where new development should go, whether it's jobs, residential, mixed use, and we've also done a lot of mapping of priority preservation areas. You know, what areas should be protected because of their natural resources, because of important water resources, because of potential impacts from climate change. And these are the areas that we should really be not encouraging growth in and really taking actions to protect them, whether it's through, you know, permanent open space protection or other regulatory structures. I think maybe, you know, the thing I'm proudest of in all this is the 10,000 participants. You know, might have had 10,001, might have had 10,000 or 2, but it really was this amazing opportunity to get out and work with people from a whole host of communities, from different backgrounds, from different interests, and I think it really helped. Right as the grant was ending up, that identified climate change. Yeah. Is it working? All right, excellent. So where was I? Talking about current work on climate change. Our agency went through a strategic planning process and came up with 4 strategic priorities, including municipal collaboration. I'm going to blank on them. It's bad, but climate change was one of them in terms of really making a lot more concerted effort on what we're doing on climate change. So a lot of our new projects are really focused on climate change mitigation and adaptation. The Metro Mayor's Climate Task Force, I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things coming out of this. They formed just last year, but the Metro Mayor's Coalition basically consists of all the mayors of kind of the big cities right around Boston, including a couple towns, like the town of Brookline, town of Winthrop are part of this as well. But they're very interested in working collaboratively across boundaries on climate change together. The Climate Smart Cities Regional Pilot. This is a BAR-funded project with a number of partners, including the Trust for Public Land, that are basically assembling a lot of the models, data, and that are of interest. Right now, for the first year, basically focusing on the city of Boston, but with the idea that we'll be able to expand this outwards and really collect a lot of the climate data and models for hopefully the whole state in the years to come. But basically making sure that people have the kind of information they need to do climate studies. And then there's 3 different place-based projects here. The Quincy Climate Resiliency Plan started this summer. So again, we're doing a lot of work with Quincy, but we're down there basically working with the city in terms of kind of taking an early assessment in terms of what their vulnerabilities are and taking that into an action plan that will guide the city's actions. A similar project is further down the South Shore in the 2 towns of Scituate and Duxbury. Again, coastal towns that do have a lot of vulnerabilities because of their coastal location. And then this Magic Subregional one is just getting underway. Again, this is kind of the Lexington, Bedford, Boxborough area out towards kind of the northwestern quadrant of 495. But this is inland, which is our first inland climate plan that we're doing. So we're going to be looking at some different impacts out there. But there's a lot of citizen engagement, a lot of active citizens that really care passionately about these issues. So it really is driven by not only the towns out there, but by a lot of concerned people that live in the towns that are active in this project. The Cambridge Business Disaster Recovery and Response Plan. This is working with primarily small businesses, a lot of immigrant businesses especially, to make sure that, should there be major storm, major disaster, that they have systems in place that they can get back online, that they don't have to shut down operations for a long period of time, which could have really devastating impacts on the business viability. So we're working with a number of small business owners on that plan. There's a new HUD program coming out called the National Disaster Recovery Competition. It's kind of I give HUD credit because they're a huge bureaucracy and they're kind of constricted in terms of what they can spend money on. But they're trying to be as creative as they can within kind of their limitations. But basically, this is a response to storms that happened between 2011 and 2013, including Sandy. So this is a nationwide competition that provides disaster recovery and planning funds. And they want innovative, interesting, exciting proposals. The city of Springfield got really, really hard hit by a tornado, I think, in 2011. So they're going to be applying for this as well as the Commonwealth. So we're working with the Commonwealth, a number of our sister regional planning agencies, and other partners on putting a grant together, the Phase 2 application. But it's mainly, they're really tied specifically to these disasters in 2011 to 2013. But I think it's a good sign that they really want to see some interesting, innovative planning and approach to what we're doing on climate change within the limitations that they have. And finally, we've historically done a lot, both as a Commonwealth and as an agency on clean energy. I think some interesting ideas coming up in terms of looking at eco-district pilots where you have much more resilient neighborhood scale, resilient communities that look at everything from composting to trash to energy at the local level. So there's a lot going on. I think we have to do it, but happy to have some questions and discussion. Thank you.